All right, hello and welcome to week 6 on the lecture series on logic and critical thinking. Today, I would like to think a little bit about language and the context um, and underlying messages and the potential strengths and weaknesses of language. And I'm going to go ahead and begin our presentation here and essentially look at the ways in which language and thought are ultimately related to one another. Okay. So this is a nice little diagram kind of denoting all of the ways in which language can be examined and understood, or at least some of the ways that it can. So, language, of course, is a system of symbols meant to be able to uh, illustrate and communicate the thoughts of an individual, essentially, right? And so, in terms of the way language is constructed, if we kind of look at the underlying information and data that goes into it, language is ultimately made up of a series of sentences. And then those sentences, of course, are constructed of words, and those words have a series of different meanings attached to them or ways of interpreting the words within the context of the sentence in order to convey the information. Okay, so we have the semantic meaning, the perceptual meaning, the syntactic meaning, and the pragmatic meaning, which we're going to get into a little bit more detail here. Then, of course, looking at language as a tool, it is a tool that is capable of, again, taking on a multitude of different roles. It allows individuals to clarify their thinking. Um, uh, the type of language that is used can be vague, it can be ambiguous, or it can be a lot more directed and precise in order to improve the clarity of the thought that is trying to be conveyed and communicated. Language is a tool for social communication as well. There are various types of language styles that people may take on. There is slang and jargon that is used in certain settings and with certain types of individuals. And then, of course, there are a number of dialects of language that regionally or based on locality may differ from one situation to the next. And then, of course, as a yet another tool, language is a means of influencing people. Um, One can come up with various expressions to fancifully explain some sort of an idea or a concept, um, going beyond what would be standard language. There is emotive language where you can convey feelings or convey the ideas behind underlying emotions. Advertising is a means of influencing people. Advertisers inform individuals and attempt to convince them to purchase a particular product over another product, which is, of course, a type of influencing or manipulation, essentially. Um, Although perhaps manipulation takes on a darker connotation than simply influencing individuals. Okay. So to kind of start off and begin to break apart all those different elements that we just looked at. When we use language, we are essentially sending a message about our thinking. We are verbalizing, we are constructing an alternative um, grouping of different symbols to be able to convey what's going on inside of our heads. And of course, language shapes and influences thinking in the reverse. Uh, the language that we use and the vocabulary that we have oftentimes the etymology of words has us thinking about different concepts in different ways. So as an example, um, if we talk about the fire inside of our hearts, that's a particular set of vocabulary that invokes a meaning that is connected to the symbology of one of the elements uh, of fire, and it denotes certain types of perhaps a physical connection to feeling what fire is like, a visual connection, perhaps, as to how fire dances about and how it can grow rapidly with the right kind of fuel. So there's a lot of ways in which the words that we use influence how we ultimately wind up thinking. And of course, to use language effectively, we need to view it as a system with rules and with expectations, right? Um, you can't just spout out a number of words. It doesn't have meaning unless you follow certain conventions, right? Things like grammatical, syntactical, and other parameters need to be established in order for a language to be meaningful and to be useful. Okay. So let's start with looking at the underlying symbology and how symbolic language can ultimately be, right? If you really sit down and think about it, language is a system of symbols for thinking and communicating, as I've already said. Language symbols are words, and those words can be expressed in more than one way. Of course, vocally through spoken sounds, and through writing, written marks. Uh, and of course, the English language has a certain way that it sounds to it, and it is written using the Latin alphabet. Um, and perhaps has some spelling conventions and grammatical conventions that essentially come together from a multitude of different uh, origin points. So there is a heavy Germanic and a heavy French Latin influence on the English language, due in large part to the core language and the influence of uh, what were ultimately Germanic peoples that had settled on the British Islands, and then later with the Norman invasion, the influence of language, a language that is very similar to modern day French, really caused the English language to kind of take on sort of a dual layer um, uh, set of sound based and written um, elements or underlying elements I think is a good word that uh, influenced how the symbology of the language ultimately came into effect. Different sounds come from the different languages that ultimately make up the modern English language, and the way that we write our language, although both the Germanic and the French influences generally wound up using the Latin alphabet as the core of that. The way that we write certain words depends on whether they come from the more Germanic roots or from the more French-inspired roots. Okay, so words can carry some very complex, multidimensional, as it says, multi-layered um, nuances based on a number of different factors. Um, and then those multidimensional meanings can include things like ideas, feelings, and experiences. And the four types of meaning that are ultimately derived from words are broken down into semantic and denotative, perceptual and connotative, syntactic and pragmatic types of meaning. Um, And, there are lots of different terms that can be used to express some of these ideas, semantic and perceptual ideas. In research, for example, might be referred to as the conceptual meaning behind the words. And then more of the pragmatic application of definitions and meanings behind words might be referred to in research as operational meanings or operational definitions. So there's a lot of different ways of kind of interpreting the underlying meaning behind the symbology of the language. And I'd like to go ahead and get into that a little bit here as well. So we're going to start with the semantics, right? The semantic meaning, the denotation of, or the denotative meaning of the words that are being used. Okay. So the semantic meaning of a word expresses the relationship between a linguistic event and some sort of a non-linguistic event. And what does that basically mean? We have the language, the symbology of the language essentially, and what the underlying meaning is of the perhaps spoken or written word in relation to that. So, for example, the word might be a chair, and it denotes something that you ultimately sit on, as an example, right? So the denotative meaning tries to express the general properties of the word that determine how it's used. And in some cases, you have very clear cut meanings, really clear cut definitions that make it very easy to understand the concept that is being conveyed. In other cases, however, things can get a little bit more complicated, right? Take, for example, the concept of happiness, right? I think everybody has a general idea, those who have commanded the English language at least, as to what happiness is. But if you really tried to sit down and try to identify, perhaps what makes a person happy versus a person that is unhappy, things can get a little bit, complicated and convoluted with regard to that, right? Some people will point to a person that is smiling as more likely to be happy, but not necessarily does everybody who is smiling actually feel happiness behind that smile. I mean, a classic example of this, my father, he's now 82 years old, but pretty much until he hit about the age of 80, he would play basketball with his neighbor across the street. That neighbor was born and raised and educated in Cambodia. And, in playing basketball together, sometimes things would get a little bit heated, right? And my father would yell at my poor neighbor. And what my neighbor would do is that he would smile very sheepishly at his father, at my father, sorry, as a way of perhaps trying to diffuse the situation, or perhaps it's just a nervous reaction to my father yelling at him, right? So in this particular case, this neighbor isn't necessarily happy, right? But rather is, as I said, either trying to ease tension with the smile or is perhaps reacting nervously. And that could be a product of the culture that he was raised in, Cambodian culture, or perhaps some sort of a regional or other cultural aspect. But when he got nervous, he did an awful lot of smiling, right? So, breaking down happiness then in terms of its semantic meaning might be a little bit more complicated with some of these slightly more complicated words that may have a little bit more of a vague and tenuous definition or underlying meaning behind them. Okay. So next we have the perceptual meaning of a word or the connotation that the word takes on. Okay, so the perceptual meaning expresses the relationship between a linguistic event and an individual's own consciousness, right? So words are capable of eliciting very unique and personal thoughts, as well as feelings based on a person's experiences and associations, right? Um, Therefore, a perceptual meaning is more of a connotative meaning or the basic meaning, as well as everything that it might suggest to a person. And, I point to poetry in this particular case, or perhaps song lyrics as examples of connotations that go beyond simply the semantic meaning that are associated behind them. Um, Let me try to think of a good example of a good song lyric. Um, Talking about emotions as an onion, for example. I know there's like a famous line in Shrek. I don't exactly remember the line, but the idea was like that ogres are basically like onions because they have many layers, right? Um, in suggesting that he's not saying that ogres are onions, but rather that there are complex underlying emotions and perhaps relevant influencing factors that cause an ogre to be the way that they are. Um, Used in similar context, there's a band called VNV Nation, and one of the lines from their song Genesis is, "If I could shed my skin, the layers left, but not the lessons learned, would not undo what I have done, nor grant forgiveness in some better day." So in this case, looking at the um, surface level uh, you know meaning or experiences that uh, the singer uh, is indicating that they're trying to rid themselves of, but basically that the underlying meaning of the actions that had been taken wouldn't undo or go away or be shed the way that the layers, much like an onion, would be shed, and there would still be the underlying negative aspects of the action that had been taken, right? So, again, the idea is perhaps you're using uh, ideas that have a different semantic meaning, right? What is an onion? It is this, often brightly flavored, perhaps sharp flavored root vegetable that is generally used for human consumption. But in the context of Shrek the Ogre, it is a way of discussing the underlying core um, elements of what makes up an ogre. And in the case of the song lyric, the layers are the superficiality. I mean, he doesn't specifically say an onion, but he does refer to layers. That kind of denotes the image of an onion, perhaps. The superficial layers that are used to mask the underlying negativity of the circumstances that the singer is ultimately singing about. The singer's name is Ronan Harris, by the way. Okay. Next up, we have the syntactic meaning here. So this meaning defines a word's relation to other words in a sentence. So there are three relationships among different words: content, description, and connection. So, what is the underlying content? What does it ultimately describe, and how is it connected to everything else within a sentence structure? And again, the sentence is ultimately a string of words or a string of these different core symbols that come together to express some sort of an idea or a thought. And then we have the pragmatic meaning. So the pragmatic meaning is it involves the person speaking and the situation in which the word is spoken. So the correct interpretation or perhaps the meaning of a sentence might depend entirely on what was taking place in the situation. So the situational meaning. So as I mentioned earlier, In research methods, we have the concept of an operational definition, right? So you take a word like happiness or depression that may have a vague or tenuous syntactic um, meaning behind it. And in order to be able to collect, quantifiable data for, a quantitative research study about a concept that has a tenuous definition like happiness, like depression, or any multitude of other concepts that we can think of, it becomes then important to utilize it the way that a researcher would need to in order to make it a researchable concept or a researchable variable. And the way you do that is you come up with a way of kind of limiting the definition so that you can measure it in some way. So, for example, with depression, for example, you might use the DSM, which is a psychological manual that tries to simplify a lot of psychological concepts, including potential mental health concerns like that of depression, and break it into a number of indicators that make up the and better paint a picture of what depression ultimately is. So, in that context, if somebody's looking up trying to find out if somebody is depressed in a psychological kind of setting, they would probably look at some of the indicators from the DSM. So, some of the things that would suggest an individual might be depressed include having a flat effect while speaking. If somebody is kind of talking in a very monotone way, it might be indicative that they are depressed, right? Think Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, right? The idea being that a number of the different animals, or the I guess they're supposed to be stuffed animals in the Winnie the Pooh world, represent different types of mental health situations. You have Eeyore, who's depression. You have Kanga and Roo, which are essentially codependents. Um, you have Piglet, who is about phobias, and Rabbit, who I guess we would define today as essentially being obsessive compulsive. So lots of different perspectives on that as well. But that is one of the indicators. Another indicator is a flat. Sorry, not I just said that. General lethargy or a lack of energy, right? Um, or you could also look at a loss of libido as one of the indicators. Um, One of the big ones in the DSM is a preoccupation with negative thoughts like taking one's own life and things like that. So that has a little bit more weight than some of the other potential indicators in getting a depression diagnosis, or if you're again conducting research to find out if somebody is depressed. One of those indicators that would point to depression as being there. So in that sense, you are taking a concept that again most people have a general idea of what depression denotes, but in order to very specifically be able to get a clinical diagnosis, you have to have a certain number of these indicators present in order for you to make that formal diagnosis. And once you hit like a certain score, in combination of all these indicators, then you can say definitively that somebody is depressed clinically. um, so now the idea of using language effectively, right? Using language effectively involves using the full range of word sense and sentence meaning to communicate our ideas in a rich and evocative way. So not simply just using the standard definitions of words, but using these words to create mental images that convey emotions, convey um, complex thoughts and ideas that perhaps the individual words would not be able to convey on their own. So the sum of the words is greater than the words that kind of construct them. So, as an example, in writing, writers are individuals who can read very widely. They're capable of using action words. They can vary their sentence length and the style depending on the audience or the emotions that are being conveyed or the message that's being put forward. And they are capable of having others evaluate their writing, right? So, in that sense, somebody who gains the skill of being able to write, for example, would have a broader access of again, these word senses and these potential meanings that underlie the sentences, perhaps than somebody that isn't necessarily as capable of writing. Okay, so using language to clarify thinking, right? There's vagueness, there's ambiguity. We saw it there with happiness, we saw it there with depression, as words that have meaning, but oftentimes are not always going to be 100% clear in what they're trying to convey. So, language that is clear and precise tends to lead to thinking that similarly is also clear and advice, and of course, vice versa, right? The language that you use also perhaps helps you to refine your thinking and systemize and organize your thoughts uh, in a fairly strong way. But we do often use vague words that are imprecise and non-specific to describe the world. So clear language and clear thinking needs to be specific, meaning that it has to convey an idea very narrowly. It needs to be distinct, not something that, might overlap in understanding with other concepts. It needs to be precise, it needs to kind of hit the target, and it needs to be very accurate. Precision and accuracy, in my opinion, are very similar concepts, but there are slight differences therein. And of course, contextually, depending on the circumstances that you find yourselves in socially, your language is going to change from situation to situation. So different social contexts are ultimately going to call for different types of language responses as well. So three common language styles here that we're looking at. We have standard American English. This doesn't necessarily denote accents and things like that, but that does kind of play a role in everything. But for example, in the United States, regardless of whether you're in New York or California or Texas or Louisiana or Florida, generally, at least academically, you're going to be taught the standard rules of American English, and people are going to follow those rules and conventions in their communication, even if they speak a little bit differently from one another. You might have somebody that perhaps has a little bit of an accent behind them, um, but still the words that are being used and the grammatical rules apply. You might get into a little bit of a southern drawl. I went and I got my education in Georgia, and a lot of people spoke a little bit slower and kind of elongated a lot of the vowels in the words that they were saying when they were communicating. But still, every word that's coming out of my mouth, despite the accent behind it, is still following those conventions of the standard American English um, language style, right? So there's mutual intelligibility. Even if you're thousands of miles away from one another, because of the rules and conventions that you ultimately follow. Now, that being said, there is slang that limits speakers to particular groups, oftentimes to particular ages or generations of speakers, right? Um, Back in the 1950s and the 1960s, some of the slang that was being used would be considerably different from perhaps the slang that was used only 20 years later, the 70s or the 80s. And then the 90s and the 2000s had different slang, and then the more recent 2010s and 2020s have substantially different slang as well. I distinctly remember I was in my history class, and we were learning about, I believe it was the 1950s, Um, and in particular, we were looking at the slang from the 1950s, and one of the words that distinctly pops into my head that was used in the conversation that we were having using this language. I was wearing a very brightly colored shirt with little spots all over it that were of all sorts of different colors. And I remember I said, you know, and it got a big laugh from everybody, including the teacher. So the thing is that we were up there, three of us, and we were talking to each other in 50s slang to kind of, understand the language of the time. And I said, my shirt looks like upchuck. And upchuck uh, is the word for vomit that perhaps in the 1980s and the 1990s people would generally refer to as barf. Um, Trying to think of what people might refer to it as today that might be distinct and different from that. But these are different contextual, socially inspired. Younger people would have used the word upchuck in the 1960s, and it would have fallen out of favor by the 1980s, for example. And people would not necessarily intuitively know what upchuck was if they mentioned it, um, and would have used a different word entirely, right? Like today we have Riz and everything like that being used by the younger generations. Um, Riz essentially referring to respect or perhaps some underlying sense of perhaps charisma that that is present. Um, the word cool is still pretty much used across the board, but I remember the 90s and the early 2000s individuals saying, "Oh, that's the bomb," or "It's bomb diggity." Nobody says that anymore, right? Um, Nobody says rad or radical either. Nobody says tubular. Um, so that would be an example of slang that doesn't follow the general rules and conventions of standard American English. And of course, that can also be a regional thing as well, right? Individuals in different parts of the United States, for example, will have different words or phrases for things that are not used in other parts of the country. Okay. We also have jargon here, and those are going to be words, expressions, and technical terms that certain professions or interest groups use. Um, in medical terminology, for example, individuals would use different words perhaps to convey ideas. The everyday person might come to the doctor and say, "Oh, I bruised my arm," or something like that, and the doctor, perhaps in their notes, would write that it was a contusion. And that's an example of jargon that is being used. The fields of the various social sciences. My degrees are in political science, public administration, and sociology. There's going to be a lot of terms that perhaps I would speak to my colleagues with that wouldn't necessarily be used in day-to-day language. Like even things like uh, the theoretical frameworks that guide our thinking about things. Just the very phrase theoretical framework is jargon for the generally accepted basic explanations of the way that the world operates, right? Positivism, interpretivism, critical theory from the sociological perspective, or realpolitik, or liberalism or constructivism from political science and public administration. These are ideas that I would convey to other individuals that were in the field, and they would understand, as well as somebody understanding what bacon and eggs are. But perhaps outside of the context of a professional setting, people would need to understand the underlying meaning or definition behind some of those words that are being used. Okay. And of course, the last concept that was in the introduction is this idea of using language to influence people, right? Language goes beyond simply conveying your own thoughts and your ideas, but you use language to get people essentially to do things. You use language to exercise power. You know, when you sit down at a restaurant, you are using language to convey what type of food dish you want to get, and influence the waiter to go and get you that food from the kitchen and to basically put it in order so that it would be cooked up and ready for you, right? Um, you can use language to get somebody to stop what they're doing by yelling at them and telling them to stop. Stop doing that. That's a way of influencing individuals. Or come over here and help me out, for example. Do me a favor would be another example of language being used to try to influence people to perhaps help you accomplish a task together, or to get them to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do, to your benefit, right? So the intimate relationship between language and thinking makes it possible to use language to influence the thinking of others, right? And then some other examples of influencing individuals or getting them to think about a concept a little bit differently would be language that tries to promote what we call the uncritical acceptance of viewpoints. So, for example, using euphemistic language, substituting a less objectionable way of saying something for perhaps a more blunt or a direct way. This being posted on YouTube, for example, YouTube doesn't like certain terms and phrases being used. So we say that, somebody unalived somebody here in YouTube. And that's an example of euphemistic language. George Carlin has a really funny bit on this, right? Um, uh, Toilet paper someday became bathroom tissue, as a way of being more euphemistic. Post-traumatic stress disorder um, uh, ultimately became operational exhaustion. Um, I mean that's what it boiled down to. But it used to be called shell shock, right? Very direct language and very, it kind of gets to the idea of what was going on there. Um, Somebody doesn't they don't die, they pass away, is another example of euphemistic language that, again, it tries to, in many ways, I think in those circumstances, limit the emotional response behind the words, um, and try to convey the meaning in a more uh, perhaps we can say clinical manner, if that makes sense. Again, using language, using terminology to kind of evoke a certain kind of response there. Clinical language, uh, reducing the emotional impact of it and kind of dealing with the core elements of what's going on, right? Of course, that being said, emotive language symbolizes and expresses our feelings, and of course, arouses or evokes feelings in others. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Um, that denotes that I'm really darn hungry, right? And a horse is a very large animal that, in this case, would probably have a lot of meat. So if I were to eat that horse, man, I would be eating a lot, right? Does that really mean that I would eat the horse? No, it's just trying to convey the underlying emotion, or the the underlying uh, degree to which I'm trying to convey the idea that I'm presenting. Okay, so to kind of summarize here, Language is ultimately a system of symbols, and those symbols come together in sentences to communicate your thinking. So it's linked to thinking and communication. Um, and of course, words and sentences are able to communicate a variety of meanings: the semantic meaning, the perceptual meaning, the syntactic meaning, and the pragmatic meaning as well. Using language involves the use of a full range of word sense and sentence meaning to communicate our thoughts in a very rich and evocative way. So we have to have a certain command of the language that we're speaking in order to be able to fully maximize it and effectively communicate the ideas that we're trying to. Language and thought ultimately work together. They're partners. It's almost like a two-way street. Clear and precise language leads to clear and precise thinking, and in reverse, clear and precise thinking leads to clear and precise language. So becoming an articulate language user is the same process as becoming a good critical thinker, essentially. You want to avoid vagueness and ambiguity in your language, and then that allows your thoughts to similarly be clearer. And, as we talked about previously in some of the other sections on critical thinking, the more we're able to effectively facilitate our decision making and to convey the meaning behind what our ideas are that we're trying to convey. Next up, effective language uses the language style that is appropriate to the context, using standard American English, very much appropriate in an academic setting. I wouldn't necessarily speak this way, the way that I'm speaking in these videos, to my wife, unless perhaps we were having some sort of an intellectual discussion or discourse. But rather, I'd probably use a lot more slang and a lot more jargon. Um, Cursing is a type of slang that generally I would avoid using in an academic setting. Sometimes it's appropriate, but generally it's inappropriate to use what we would consider bad language. That would be a euphemism there for cursing. Um, Definitely use it a lot more with my friends and individuals that I'm not having a more professional or intellectual or academic conversation with. So language is a powerful tool for expressing the thinking and behavior of others. And again, emotive and euphemistic language are language that tries to manipulate individuals. And then, of course, just in general, articulating your desires to individuals. It's another way to kind of get them to behave a certain way. And then, of course, new media have come into play. And they really have an important impact on our lives, and it really makes the importance of speaking the language clearly and communicating effectively all the more important, right? YouTube, for example, is a fairly new way of presenting ideas, and it makes a fantastic platform for the communication of different ideas, or in the case of university lectures, as I'm doing here for my asynchronous logic and critical thinking course, but also to make it available to a wide variety of people. I was looking at some of the videos that I've recorded in the past, and I've got hundreds or dozens of views for some of my videos. Even though right now my logical and critical thinking class is probably somewhere around 20 people, it's kind of nice to see that about 80 people have viewed a certain video as of this particular date, and perhaps more individuals will view some of those other videos, and that number is going to get bigger. That's outside of my classroom, right? And I think being able to convey the information, in this case using standard American English, helps a lot of people to think about some of the ideas in this field of study or in this course of study um, pertaining to logic and critical thinking. So that all being said, thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to speaking about even more interesting topics pertaining to logic and critical thinking in the days to come.